for an hour, folks. Okay, I'm gonna mute you, Charles, and I'll count you in. Oh, you're on the button.
Perhaps it is cliche that stops me leaning over the railing so many hands have touched, my mind becoming the cloud shadows, 2 shades darker than the bay they drift on shortly after noon. As lunch crowds gather, I tell myself I am not the lavender shit of ordinary seagulls on the pylon rocks below, where spreading waves terminate, reborn as cannons. The students on a field trip just down from me squawk at, feigning fear, boom spray, boom, the inevitable endpoints of any arc. Surprise them still. Standing here, I understand. Even if there is space today for a dream of green islands in the distance between us, my friends and me, I think, some of them don't know me at all. Bridge, a poem of Brian Tierney's from his most recent collection, Rise and Float. Good evening. My name is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry in our 8th season. The focus of our program has been, as always, to give our viewers and our listeners the experience of the rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia. So tonight we really have a very special guest, and I say special because while he is being broadcast from Oakland, California, he is originally from Philadelphia. So once you say you're from Philadelphia and you're an artist, we automatically own you. So, and that's Brian Tierney. Brian is the author of Rise and Float, the winner of the 2021 Jake Adam York Prize. Brian's poetry and prose have appeared in such journals as the Paris Review, Kenyon Review, AGNI, NER, the Adroit Journal, and others. Brian, a former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University and a graduate of the Bennington College MFA Writing Seminars, he was named the Narrative Magazine's 2013 30 Below 30 Emerging Writers and is the winner of the 2018 George Bogan Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. Raised in Philadelphia, Brian now lives in Oakland, as I said, where he teaches poetry at the Writing Salon. So welcome, Brian. Welcome home to Philadelphia.
Hi,
It's
hi,
great to have
Charles.
you
Happy to
here.
be here.
Yeah, yeah. So first off, I want to say I really love this book, and
Thanks so
yeah,
much, Charles.
I love the diction. I love the images, the voice. Rereading this collection, and I felt a very strong sense of intimacy with these poems. Uh, but most of all, and I can't say this about every book of poems I read, and with not faulting any other books, I took away a lot from these poems that I was really making me think about, my own life. To me, this is where I really appreciate poetry that goes really the next step beyond art. And it's didactic. I don't want to say therapeutic because I think that's a little heavy. But the poetic persona that is forthcoming here, with the details of your life, and the details of your memories uh, really let the reader really experience with you some of the same things that they're feeling. So I think that's one of the above the absolute beauty of your language, the structure, and of course I love the brevity of your poems and how much you accomplish in that space. But it is a really, I really felt that it was an experience. So the first question I wanted to pose to you, because I really am fascinated with the title, Rise and Float. And I felt that somewhere in reading a couple of poems, I could see elements of that idea, Rise and Float. But can you tell us why you selected that title?
Definitely, yeah. First of all, thanks for that intro, Charles. I appreciate all the kind things you said about Rise and Float. When it took me quite a while to kind of see the book for what it needed to be. I think for a long time I thought it would be about my father's death from lung cancer in my early 20s, and it became the universe of the book ended up becoming much larger uh, in terms of my own life, and it became about different types of griefs and losses, and I think suffering in various capacities, physical and kind of psycho-emotional and spiritual. And so it took a long time. There were many other titles uh, for the book, and I had shown it to a friend of mine, another poet and novelist, William Brewer, who's an amazing poet, and he said the title's not it. He says, there's a lot of Jersey in here, because there is too. I mean, my parents are from New Jersey originally, and I'm the kind of native Philadelphian. And he said, why don't you look in Williams? Open up Williams and see, look for phrases, look for things. And that's exactly what I did. I opened up Williams' long, kind of epic, convoluted book, Patterson, and I just started flipping through, kind of looking for different phrases that might kind of jump out at me, might speak to something kind of subconscious that I'm feeling about the book that you kind of can't get at consciously. And I came upon this one section of Patterson that was about this industrial fire, and it talked about the kind of embers rise and float off the fire. And I heard that phrase and I thought, that's something. And once I kind of laid it on the book and I read the book through with the title on it, all of a sudden it was it. It just like it was the last kind of piece of the puzzle. And I think it did a couple of things I really wanted the title to do, which was to speak kind of in different ways about what the book was. And so in a way it's a command, rise and float.
We lost him.
Do what I was able to kind of focus on in terms of healing some of my family members who are gone, kind of asking their ghosts to rise up and be released. And that felt really it to me. And I think it's also to the self, because a lot of the book, as you know, deals with my own struggles with mental health and sometimes struggling to want to keep living. And I think that's also a kind of message to myself: rise, float, don't sink, kind of at least float. So that's the story of the history of
Wonderful.
the title of the book.
Well, I'm glad it's Williams. I mean, I love his work, and Patterson,
Me too.
especially. Um, the other thing about this book that is intriguing, and I really think it's a triumph, because somebody could read this and say, "Well, isn't this a confessional book?" And
Hmm.
I didn't have any sense of, of that this is like confessional poetry. This is poetry and very strong. And I mean, yes, there's memoirs and there's aspects of your early life and the whole lineage of your family, the issues of mental health, etc. But the book escapes that kind of categorizing, and I think it's a real triumph for you that it does. Obviously, that's why it's got the word. I think the other amazing thing, this is your first published book of poem, correct?
That is, yeah. It took a
And
little
and,
while to
and
get it
yeah,
published.
well, okay, but here you come with a very prestigious award, so that's really amazing, and hats off to you. That you were able to accomplish. I think it's an award-winning collection of poetry, uh,
Thank you,
without
Charles.
question. The one thing, and I think we talked about it when we were preparing for the broadcast, was this um, word that keeps coming up. I kept revisiting it, and that's the word whole. Of course, it appears in a poem of yours, "Fixing a Hole," and for example, in one of the poems that is about your aunt who was treated for a mental health condition in the old type of psychiatric hospital. You even mention in there the rusting holes in the electric device in that hospital, and I keep coming back, but only because I think of you know counselors sometimes will say to the client, there are holes in your life that you need to address. And I always think of also, in these detective stories where somebody says, there's a lot of holes in his alibi. But there's so many, for example, in the poem Polyphagia, uh, the word is not used, but it's replaced. It says replace the hole as hunger that begs to be filled with. And I'll just quote these amazing lines of poetry. All that time, me thinking it was hunger. All the time seeking some shadow, when it was a shadow seeking going on within me. Which continues in the poem. While my body, like a sponge beneath dark, frigid water, floating what I'd mistaken for craving, compulsion became one weight, sinking like a fathometer, limits measuring, emptiness, to see at what death even God turns around. And then the poem continues later, echoing this theme, quoting a stranger who was walking with a crane you met. It says, turns out rock bottom's not a problem, he said, when you begin without a bottom. So can we talk about that, the holes, the emptiness, and in a broader sense, how you're filling these holes with these poems and with these stories, as almost like there is somehow a reconciliation, a filling of a hole. I mean, that's what I felt.
Yeah, I think one of the projects of the book, it's a word project I always kind of, I'm skeptical of, but I think there is a project, to the book. And I think part of it is to come to terms with a very kind of, we might say Buddhist, certainly Eastern cosmology understanding of suffering, which is that there being absences is part of the nature of being alive. That kind of holes are part of the condition of existence in some way. And so I think the book, the word became a kind of a obsession, and somebody, I think Richard Hugo, who's a poet from Montana, wrote a book called The Triggering Town, and it's a great teaching text. But in it, he talks about how it's actually important for poets to have an obsession and for their vocabulary to kind of embrace that obsession. And he mentioned how, in James Wright's famous The Branch Will Not Break, his mid-60s book, I think mid-60s or early 60s book, he included the word dark like 46 times or something. And there's a way in which of course, when a poet does that, right, there's intentionality to it. It's not accidental. It's not a couple of repetitions. It's many. And in terms of the whole, I think for this book, it really started with that poem. There's a poem in it called Ideation, which is about suicide and imagines the whole suicidal ideation and imagines the whole as kind of this metaphor, that for the thing that you're kind of staring into, almost like a pit. And from there, the whole started to emerge in other places, both metaphoric and real. So, for instance, that one poem you mentioned about the derelict psychiatric hospital, there are holes in the walls where like restraints used to be. And in the poem, for instance, Wormhole, the first poem of the book, hole takes on a very different, kind of density and figuration. And all of a sudden, the hole is a channel, it's a passage through space-time, as the wormhole is, in a sort of astral or astronomical sense. And I think there are other times, where the whole is related to death, in My Father in the Grave. And so there's ways in which I started to realize one of the imagistic obsessions of the book was a whole, and that holes could take on different meanings in different contexts. And in the book, I think there's kind of physical meanings of whole, there's psycho-emotional meanings, there's spiritual, metaphysical, and that for me, that the complexity of that, it makes the whole kind of work as an image, as opposed to trying to put all of the weight into just one kind of variation or one version of it. And so I guess absence and desire and the sense of wanting to pass through space and time are why the whole kind of emerged, maybe, subconsciously while writing. And I kind of went with that because I think it invites different ways of relating to the image. One of them is the whole terminates and it's filled with something. The other sense is you pass through space and time. Another sense is, there's a poem about my struggles with an eating disorder, bulimia, and the whole then kind of becomes the throat. It becomes the toilet, and not to be grotesque, but it is in the work there. And I think that there's ways in which the whole becomes, a metaphysical concern to me for the book.
Well, I think it's really very helpful as kind of centering point as one reads this. I mean, you don't club us over the head with it, okay?
I hope not.
And I mean, one could, but you subtly find it, and I really admire that because sometimes it's like a guiding force in reading a book of poems, in better understanding where and how deep the poet is trying to get. I see it again, for example, there again in Tailpipe, when you talk about the suicide of your sister, is it correct?
My aunt.
Your aunt. And there's a line in there in this poem. I imagine the silence of the rafters after she died, the absence above her asking to be filled. And then also in the felled cherry tree, the way it is so beautifully put. I also dreamed I was next to you, and the memory of your holes remain somehow. So, I mean, it's just remarkable how you're able to use this, to really absorb, for somebody to really absorb these poems. I think in one poem you actually uses the image of a sponge somewhere, and I thought of that as as like kind of what a sponge does, and kind of brings you in a substance in. So the other part of these poems, and there's so many aspects to it. I don't want to say, but also this. What I'll say is the issue of religion and spirituality. You know, I mean,
Hmm.
there's God, there's Judas, there's other aspects of spirituality and religion here. Um, for example, I I just want you to discuss this aspect of your poetics. In this poem, all stars are lights, not all lights are stars. And I'll quote it: I see heaven is not a place. It's a concept for pain, a pattern for snow on municipal metal stairs. I ascending now, leading nowhere. I know but a good place to lie down and hope I roll off and make a seraph where I fall. So, can you discuss this spirituality, this kind of wrestling with these with religion? Is that a function of the dynamic when you were being raised? I couldn't really tell.
So yeah, I was raised Catholic. I'm half Irish, half Italian, and a very Philadelphia combination. And my father was a Roman Catholic priest in the 70s, and he left, obviously, and had met my mother. And my mother had actually kind of studied to be a monastic nun. She was in the stage called novitiate, which is before you take your vows, and she left. They ended up meeting and had me and my brother, and but we grew up Catholic. You know, I think we grew up in a very, I would say, pretty leftist Catholic. You know, it was much more social justice oriented than I think a lot of Christianity tends to be at this point. But it was always, your brother's keeper was kind of the tenor of it. And so I actually grew up with a positive relationship to, you know, Christianity and spirituality. And, I was an altar boy and continued that even in high school. And, but, maybe it's an old story. My father got sick. He died. All my grandparents started dying, and death crept in and kind of put a hole in the balloon, and it leaked over many years. And so, now I am pretty much an atheist, but I think the phantom limb of that spirituality, the kind of itch of wanting there to be maybe more meaning to suffering, um, is one of the driving kind of forces of the book, is the kind of investigation of what does it look like when you keep coming up against the fact that there isn't always meaning for loss or suffering. In fact, there usually isn't. Um, and I think that curiosity and that pain, I mean, I think it is, when you grow up a kind of believer and you fall away, there is a pain of that. That's another kind of absence that the book is engaging with, though it's not as explicit, right? In the actual content, what you're noticing, I think, Charles, is that a question that drives it, that I almost am afraid, because I already know the answer to, is how it feels. But the book still, and the material in my life still includes that spirituality and that history as part of the universe of my experiences and the things that made the book kind of what it is. But I don't think there's any answers, and it's something I still kind of write about. God and falling away from God, and just spirituality in general. It creeps in to my work even now, and I'm working on the second book.
Well, I like the description that you gave it, a phantom limb. You know that it's still there in a way, but it's doesn't have flesh and blood to it, but there's inside of you. There's still that. I mean, I went to Catholic uh, uh, grammar school, high school, and I went to a Catholic college. Um,
Same.
although the Catholic college was really was in the '60s, and it was moving far away from a strong religiosity. I mean, it's not like you had to show up and go to mass once a week, or, but still in all, I mean, I continued, and I've continued recently, uh, but still there is that, what you call it, a phantom in you. And some people, they call it, well, oh, Charles, you're guilty. You feel guilt because they programmed you to feel this way, that, you haven't gone to mass on Sunday. You haven't kept holy the days of obligation, holy days of obligation, etc. So there is, I can appreciate that. There's very much that in my own psyche, that I have to deal with. I deal with it in my own way. It's really interesting. This is just a sidebar. Last month I had uh, a, a Jewish writer, poet, fascinating, who actually sponsors these Jewish services which are out of the mainstream. And she got me interested, and I actually read the whole litany or liturgy of this one, and it just blew me away, which is so
Mm.
powerful. And I say I want to come back to this because this is speaking to me in a way that other things have not been speaking to me. So we're getting close to time when we want to put you on stage, but where are you now? What are you working on now? And what are you working toward in your poetry?
Well, that's a big question. I think it's still revealing itself. The second book um, has also kind of been developing over the years. I started kind of writing it parallel to the first book because I had finished versions of that book for quite a while, and it did take time for it to get published. But I kept kind of editing. I kept adding every year, every month. I'd switch out new poems, and so I think, I don't know. I think the first book is a certain kind of experience, I assume. The second book, it feels a little more slippery, but I would say that um, the book is kind of interested in what I've called Love in the Ruins. It's a title from a Walker Percy book from the 70s, a novel, and it's kind of dystopian, almost comic at times. But I read it in college. I don't even remember it, but I do remember that phrase, and that phrase has been kind of a guiding principle, if you will, of the book. And so maybe the obsession of the book is I'm trying to get at the beauty and pain of being alive in a certain very fascistic, troubling moment in the world. And I think especially in the West, where power is against us as the people, almost in every way, it seems. And things are trying to break our spirits. And so I think there's a way in which the poetry is born out of wanting to be very present, and I'm writing love poems about, my wife who I've been with for 15 years, and I'm writing to my nephew. My first nephew was born in October. My brother's 40. It's the first child born in our family since I was born. It's a big deal, and it's the first moment of a kind of new generation and a new possibility that I didn't feel before, and a parental love. I don't have children, and we won't be having children, my wife and I. But so it's a very interesting sense of love and affection that I've never felt. And I've been thinking a lot about what the future is going to bring, what world we're leaving children. And so I think that really is one of the driving forces of the book as well. And so there are some allegorical kind of dystopian post-apocalyptic poems. There are poems that are very much about being alive in the present. And I think those two things are touching kind of constantly in the book, as I'm also directly addressing my nephew. I'm writing direct address poems to my wife. And so there's a different kind of intimacy. You said that with Rise and Float, and I agree. My goal was to be as intimate as possible in a way that felt invitational to somebody else's imagination. So they didn't feel it was just purely confessional, but that it left room for their imagination to experience it. And in this book, I want to do that too, but I think it's much more present focused. The Rise and Float is really about the past. and reckoning with loss in the past and my family's history, and trying to kind of relieve them, even though they're dead. They're kind of, you know, release their spirits from this shared story in a way. And I think the second book is much more about the present, you know, the things of the earth. It's much more tactile and material oriented. And I think maybe you would agree, Charles, I don't know, but Rise and Float certainly feels more ethereal. It feels more spiritual or metaphysical. You know, there are obviously real things in it, but its concerns are somewhat invisible. And I think that's not true in the second book, at least as I imagine it.
Yeah, I like that idea that you're talking about, because this has been an obsession with me in terms of, you know, I don't know how much time I have left, but I keep saying, when my wife and I, who's very much an environmental artist and an environmental advocate and has been, is what are we going to tell the next generation and the generation after that? I mean, about the current existential dilemma. What are we going to tell them? And that's a big dilemma.
That question haunts me, Charles.
Yeah.
Haunts me.
What are we going to tell them? So this has been a great discussion. I could go on, for another show, just talking to you about poetry. But our audience wants to hear you read your poems, and I think it's going to be a real treat for them to hear you read these poems, because they're fabulous.
Thank you, Charles. I'm happy to share it to be back in Philly sharing it.
Okay.
You're the one I want to watch the last ships go down with. For Jess. Dr. Redacted will tell me not to tell you this. Like this. In a poem. How it's all right, love, that we don't love living. Even actors don't exactly love the spotlight they move through, as your sister, the actor, had told us. They just need to be lit for narrative motion to have meaning. As such it is with artifice and embarrassment. I move through fear to you tonight. For I had dreams a short nap ago about lines of poetry I struck through with everyday blues. Month after month, and the dream after dream. An attempt, I guess, to forget if I could. Defeat sometimes is defeat without purpose. The news, at least, tells me that much. I know now, in fact, we don't have to be brave. Not to survive a night like any we've looked on together. Watching blue-tinted snow once in a Kmart parking lot's giant two-headed lamp. My father hooked up the street with no chance of waking. As many years ago now as how much longer I've lived with you than without. Forgive me again that I write you an elegy where a love poem should be. So I grew up in Philadelphia, as we've said. I grew up in the Northeast section, kind of between the low Northeast and the far Northeast, in Tarsdale and Holmesburg, and would hang out in Mayfair and Tacony, and that area was my kind of childhood. And, I think place is a really big part of this book. Philadelphia and New Jersey make appearances, and specific kind of landmarks and streets appear throughout the book. And I think the way that setting bears down upon people's lives and helps determine kind of the lives they live is very much part of the book. And so Philly was never far from my mind, obviously in a book about my past. And, my parents are native New Jerseyans, and they moved here. I was actually born in New Jersey, but we moved when I was 5 months old, and so I'm the true Philadelphian of the bunch, and it's in my DNA, and it's in the experiences these poems try to kind of bring to life in a way. One of those places, I grew up not far from Cottman Ave, which is a big east-west street in Northeast. And so this poem is inspired by that street, by a house there. Cottman Avenue House Party. Hour 2. John's trying to take his shadow off. On the neighbor's lawn, stray bottles arranged in green glass bouquets. I hear someone scream. In the cockeyed towers of the poorly run junkyard, just behind Tim's, groaning like cellos, unspooling in the wind. I recall the boy when I was a boy, who'd hopped its fence and was torn open by its sentinel Dobermans, whose violence, we were told, was certainly atypical. The owner who shot them hung their tags from a mounted shuriken. Somewhere above all that metal shit shifting, I imagine 2 beautiful teenagers are kissing. I recall pigeons, televisions, fridges in there. Other winters, other screams. My cousin Kristen's limp right hand fanned open near the paint can in the suicide scene. My friend Tim appears in the book a couple times. He grew up down the street from me on State Road, at the right along the edge where, Philly hits the Delaware River. So sometimes I get news from him. He keeps me apprised of what's going on in the city and what's the vibe. So he's in this one, makes a cameo. The fly in the bottle. Tim called to say Fentanyl Jen from Tacony, Palmyra jumped off the bridge but lived. My God. And I said, God. But I meant, I hope our corpses keep the trees awake forever. And suddenly, at the thought, memory presents itself. Like a yellow light you gotta run through to beat the cross-street traffic near the Dreaming Ant Diner. Wearing a cabbage print dress and John Lennon shades one summer, in chemical distress. Jen stabbed with her fork her 2 sunny yolks, saying, angels, my angels, over and over, as if to coerce the eggs back into their caves, as if to euthanize what might have been her soul, by which I mean her mind, each time piercing what had already deflated. Breakdown. They raise swiftly each interstate mystery. The haunted house, the astrolabe, the silent calliope emptied of air, ornate as a head of state's coffin on wheels. Its gold-painted spokes, its faux ivory panels, as chipped and streaked as my mother's teeth were then, which, even in memory, she can't afford to fix. This is in lieu of what I really want to say. In an hour, the children we were here will sleep, forgetting their bodies, forgetting umbilical air gun stalls, the feel of the handles and the reins of the horses speared through on poles for travel, unmounted, laying side by side like a Civil War still life together in the fennel as tall as a person, taller even than parents among the patrons, with their paper cones of sugar as they leave, sweeter than soda, sweeter even than Matthew. The pear taste on his lips I savor any time I eat a Waldorf salad. suddenly younger and with him again, rewatching the caravan prep its procession to some next destination. T-christened hearses and escort vans, econo trailers and towing booths and tosser stands from which any one of us could buy brass rings to throw through a cardboard circle of a bangle's mouth and beyond its black drape. Its rough crepe synth linen mix, with its fabric stars affixed comically to the drape. Behind which, if you dared peel it for a peek between shifts while the vendor on break would be rolling a joint with his boo-boo stash, behind all that you'd see each $1.20 fate, each zill where it fell unseen behind the drape. Into a daisy print bucket filled with them they'd leave till near end, the carnies, or whatever we call them now, needing 2 of them to lift it, and sometimes more. That's about a carnival that used to come into town every year. It was Archbishop Ryan is one of the biggest, I think, Catholic high schools on the East Coast. That's in the Northeast, and they would come in and we go to this thing, and inevitably, somebody get punched or somebody flash a knife. A couple people got stabbed for whatever reason. It always would turn into some seedy affair. But there's something about the carnival that really drew me, that memory, this kind of sense of the illusion of reality, and I think this book really is about so much about memory that's I think of the Joan Didion quote from Blue Nights, which is an elegiac prose book, nonfiction book about the death of her daughter, I believe. Mm-hmm. But the quote is something like, "Time passes, memory fades, memory adjusts, memory conforms to what we think we remember." And boy, that's the guiding principle of so much of this book, I think, is that idea that there's a difference between memory and kind of things as they were. And I don't know that we can ever kind of pull them apart as people or poets, but it's part of the work. I worked with a Van Boland, who was an Irish poet, when I was at Stanford, a truly great Irish poet, one of the greats of the 20th century. And she had some line like, "I learned the difference between memory and knowledge," which I think is brilliant. I think that's true. Memory is inherently different than kind of the truth, whatever that is. We had talked about a poem taking place in Jersey at a derelict psychiatric hospital called Greystone Park. That was the one Charles had referenced if you were with us earlier. And my aunt had been there, my great grandfather, great uncle, some cousins, and it was a kind of all-purpose place, and it dehumanized people, and many of them got shock therapy and actually didn't need it, and it affected them worse. And so, I definitely wanted to. It's a very famous place. Woody Guthrie was put there for reasons that had nothing to do really with true mental health problems. I think Bob Dylan visited him there. It has a kind of legacy, this place. But the truth is that the experience of the actual old derelict hospital is built out of a memory I'd have of Byberry Hospital, which people may remember, which is in the Northeast and was also kind of famous for being brutal. And people would go there and kind of haunt this very, derelict, empty building. And it always kind of, you could feel the kind of ghosts of that place there. And it was, terrifying in its own way. So all of that kind of goes into this poem. Greystone Park. I looked down the corridor of shredded red paint and soft cream messy peeled, like wrist skin when a grater slips. Water damage, I say to Tim. With me on a dare here. An extension built to relieve the Trenton Madhouse, 7 train stops south, where you can buy cheap acid from a guy they call Lobotomy for the star across his head. We take 2 small hits. Now scraps of trash greenly drift like unraveled petals of water lettuce in puddles, and I swear I hear breathing. So which of these fuckers was hers? Meaning my great aunt, Evelyn's. Her cell, of course. I don't know. As I listen to Tim kicking corroded metal instruments in a janitor's closet, I hear it again. Her silver spoon hitting the plate. Going too deep. Her laugh as good as scream. Just a few stray anecdotes she told us that breakfast. The leather tentacles squeaking every flinch. Gloves gripping a steering wheel in winter. How the shock machine in 1960 felt all fog as it breathed behind her eyes, dissolved her spine. Chlorpromazine in a glass of water the first time, until each surrounding color had a sound I can imagine had no end but in the body, as in a drain. Near the wall restraints, stains only butchers would have known about. Rusting holes. Holes where holes are not supposed to be.
I think they turned Byberry into a commercial facility. It's no longer, it's no longer a hospital, as most all the mental health facilities in this area and everywhere, when they went to quote unquote a community-based focus. So it'd be
Absolutely.
interesting
Yeah.
to see when you come back, what is that place like now? But yeah, it's a very different.
I'm
very
imagining like
different feel.
condos, Charles.
Yeah, probably. You're right. Condos, exactly.
But you know what? That's better than
Yeah,
the House of Horrors it was.
yeah.
I much prefer teletherapy. And this poem is one I wrote. It was one of the last poems I wrote for the book, and it was like right in the beginning, kind of the pandemic. We're probably in May of 2020. So like a lot of us, I mean, I needed therapy. I mean, I needed it anyway, but I needed it. So teletherapy. The light of that jet overhead is my mind I'm seeing, so scintillant, unreachable. I am never where my body is. The first law of dreaming is what isn't here isn't me. The second law is to show you what I see is to show you how I feel. Aluminum siding the color of my skin, enwrapping the duplex where I lived as a boy, by the ruins of a bridge for what could not be united. The message is frail. When I check my phone to remember I exist and I shake it, I shake myself, as if to clear the etch-a-sketch of my face. If I'm dead inside, how would I know? How would a bulb check its own filament?
What a last line.
So I'll just say, trigger warning to those people with eating disorders, in case that might be a lot for you. This is called bulimia. On AM radio, a post-war hit, a courtship by sea. That first time I emptied consciously. I focused on the xylophone to drown me out. In the tune, a boat for two on one end was sinking through a modest raunch meant to trick the children. So many leaks, not enough fingers, my sweet. When I put one in my mouth, I nearly touched the bell of my voice. I've done this for years, wanting to be a love song, a little less each week. An abstraction too immense, like the Pacific's continent of trash and crazy migration. Accumulating summits I try to imagine bear with them part of what I've released, unbelieving the soul. What it is and what it becomes as it splashes into water makes a lovely sound. Vanishing shapes I can sometimes almost see myself in. An anthill, a dung heap, the beginnings of a moon there is no way to reach. So I was very privileged to be able to work with the great Louise Glick, may she rest, who just recently had passed, not before winning the Nobel, which she absolutely deserved. And so when I was at Stanford, she taught the spring workshops in the Stegner program, and she would invite fellows to her house individually, which she rented in Berkeley every week or other week, to talk poems, which was an amazing privilege, but also extremely daunting. You get there, and Louise is very small and very kind of, or very wry humor and kind of quiet in her own way. And you'd sit there and you'd give her a poem, and one of these poems I remember, it involved some animal. I can't remember the exact animal, but I handed her the poem, and as usual, she read it in absolute silence for what felt like forever. And she eventually looked up very slowly, sighed, turned to me and said, "This poem is so fucking corny." Excuse my French, but, and I obviously lost it. I thought that was hilarious. And she was right. It was corny, but I took it as a kind of challenge. And so this one goes out to Louise Glick. It's called Hearses. A professor once wrote me that to write of fruit or flowers or dreams, no matter how deftly, is the lowest form of metaphor, after processions. Years later, on the subject again, she that time indicted horses as well, most especially wild ones. Even the word wild itself, government arrogated. Legally defined, she meant, not by what the wild horses are as a species, but the context by which they roam and where. And the manner in which the land was theirs, she meant, was cheapened, made public. An open space also owned. Plains I refuse to render or repopulate, having read only yesterday how after the sweeps, which the Bureau of Land calls mustanging, the colonial Spanish feral descendants remain somehow sentient during dismemberment, later sold. I think the saw's sound, though an obsession of itself, after a while must otherwise be mundane. No more than an idling truck full of Swedish fish, my union friend drives from Hanover east to Clifton and Passaic, then over the Passaic River. Its color when rushing, a soiled denim, like my grandpa wore on the Morris County sewer crew 30-plus years, below the roads, breathing children's waste from St. Mary's. And eventually, the truck of red treats arriving unseen at a 7-Eleven, where a night clerk hands back loose heads of presidents the customer trusts by combined weight as the right change for a 10 or 2 5s. Lincoln and Roosevelt touching inside a pocket, jinkling as they pass. Adjacent to the door, a smell of cold roses in a sad yellow bucket, similar to one I puked in one June several times, after waking from a nightmare in which I was dying ignobly in the back of a cab. A heart attack, on the Garden State Parkway, while a low-angled sunset beat the marshlands into flat, metallic fields. And beneath my hand, on my galloping breast, I felt the angles of a matchbook in my shirt pocket, with its blue font reading, thank you, please keep closed. As if against my heart lay the door to a stable.
I think we have time for one more poem, Brian, and then we're going to wrap up.
That's perfect. I think I'll end with the first poem,
Okay.
because the beginning is always the end too. If that suits you, Charles, is that good?
Yes, great.
Okay. Wormhole. All winter, the house groaned as in a very great depth, so that I often couldn't sleep. Then one day, as if the inverse of lightning, silence occurred, entrusted to the hour. I became each minute. I became every direction at once and fled from source and definite position and returned to my mother in plaid widow slippers, the blue flaking hallway at the end of which she'd wrapped gifts with the funny papers. And I felt again the weight of her life shaping my fate. When she paused, I paused. When she looked down, I looked as well down into the garden, at the material consequence of a metaphysical truth. Memorial flowers we'd planted, then left. These rooms will outlive you, I had told her once in spite, when I was younger, not young, while she hung our shirts above and around a busted upright to dry in the sun of a perfect angle, in which to watch was to surrender metamorphic mystery, but equally fear. Having set aside changes I could think of as tracks to be followed, future possibilities, arguments of a speculative nature, the roads with nobody on them and with no one to remember anyone who was, I walked into that garden. When I bent to them, the impatience soured and gave a small yelp. Some of them had names I could not take with me. Night fell. The treasure I thought at the outset was wholeness was not wholeness. A passing car went white as the head of a match and was gone.
Wow. Thank you, Brian, so much. This has been a really great broadcast, and I'm so glad. I won't get into the details of the fate, how I found you. Kind of a name mistake, and thank God for social media.
Absolutely.
But it was very faithful. But thank you again. I strongly recommend this to anybody who loves poetry. Rise and float. Just want to make a final appeal and to support Moonstone Arts Center, and you can go on our site moonstoneartscenter.org, and you can find a way that you can continue to support all that we do. I mean, this is just one part of what we do for Moonstone. There's readings every Wednesday night at Fergie's Pub. Larry is publishing like crazy anthologies and chapbooks and chapbook contests, et cetera, et cetera. So he's a treasure, and Moonstone Art Center is a treasure, a cultural treasure of Philadelphia, and should be treated as such. So good night. Again, thank you so much, Brian. Much enjoyed this time with you.
Thank you, Charles. Happy to be here.